It's really a pleasure for me to introduce Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat. I don't think we've ever met one-on-one, but I'm a longtime admirer of yours. And I actually worked on the same 1976 presidential campaign that you did, but you had a much more senior role than I did. Ambassador Eizenstat is one of this country's most distinguished public servants of the last half century. I actually don't know anyone who knows anything about American public affairs who would dispute that characterization. Some of you may remember that most recently he gave a very stirring eulogy, which I have recommended to a couple of you last month, for the first American president he served. I might say the first.
Actually, the second.
Oh, who was the first?
Lyndon Johnson.
Oh, okay. You must have been like a college student when you worked in the Johnson administration.
First job after Harvard Law School.
But in any case, he has served 6 presidential administrations. So that solves part of the puzzle of my trying to figure out what the 5th and 6th were. In one powerful speech in January, I think Ambassador Eizenstat did more than anyone I can remember to correct the record and revive the legacy of President Jimmy Carter as a president of great accomplishments in both domestic and foreign policy. Ambassador Eizenstat was raised in Atlanta and returned there after Harvard Law School to clerk for a federal judge and then practice law. He then worked as issues director for Jimmy Carter's successful 1970 campaign for governor of Georgia, and for 4 years as chief domestic policy advisor in the Carter White House. And then came an amazing array of weighty responsibilities to follow that weighty one. He served the Clinton administration for 8 years as ambassador to the European Union, undersecretary of Commerce, undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, and then Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. He has devoted much of his career to the pursuit of restitution of Holocaust-era assets to the original owners of their heirs, first as President Clinton's special representative on Holocaust-era issues, and in various roles since then, including as chairman of the U.S. Holocaust Museum Council, appointed by President Biden. I hope that the current president has not terminated that, but
Not yet, but I'm sure that will be coming.
in all, he has, as I've said, served in 6 presidential administrations, and in these various public roles, and in his work as an international lawyer in Washington, D.C. with Covington and Burling, Ambassador Eizenstat has become a true and honored practitioner of the art of negotiation. In fact, he received the Great Negotiator Award from Harvard Law School. So the book he'll speak about today, The Art of Diplomacy, distills the most important lessons from America's experience with international negotiations. It's based not only on his own vast experience across the 6 presidential administrations, but also interviews with 125 US and international leaders, including 2 former presidents and 8 former secretaries of state. So, Mr. Ambassador, over to you.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I think I'd like to divide my talk as follows. I'll give about 20 minutes or so on an outline of why I wrote the book and the key lessons. And then we can focus, because I know many of you are focused on the Middle East. We focus on the Middle East and the Gaza situation and on Ukraine. And I have to say that I should put a second edition of the book out, because all the lessons I'm about to impart from interviewing 130 people have been turned on their head by our current president in the last month. And it'll be interesting to see if this is a new way of approaching negotiation. So I wrote the book for 3 reasons. The first is that we live in a very turbulent era in which we face seemingly insoluble problems. And I want to demonstrate by 12 case studies looking at major agreements over the past 50 years, that we faced equally daunting problems and solved them through diplomacy, and we can do so again. Second, we're in the midst of two hot wars in Gaza and Ukraine, but in my lifetime, we've gone through a whole series of wars: Vietnam, the two Balkan wars in Kosovo and Bosnia, the two Iraq wars under Bush 1 and 2, our longest war, 20 years in Afghanistan, and Libya, which President Obama said was his worst mistake. And I wanted, therefore, to take a hard look at whether, when, and how the use of force can be an instrument in promoting diplomacy, and when it should be used and when it shouldn't be used. And third, we're entering into an era of, I'm afraid, isolationism, not unlike that between the First and Second World Wars. And I want to demonstrate by the book that with all the conflicts we have in the world today, the world would be a much less accommodating place had the United States not engaged in trying to solve these problems. And to the extent that we withdraw behind what our current president calls this big, beautiful ocean that we have, and leave the rest of the world to its own devices, we will be leaving an enormous vacuum into which countries like Russia and China and Iran and those with very different interests and values will fill, and we'll have an even more conflicted world for our children and grandchildren. Now, diplomacy, the art of diplomacy, means simply the ability to try to find a common ground between your negotiating partner and yourself, and to convince that partner, representing a sovereign state, that it's in their interest to do what is in America's interest. Where that doesn't exist, for example, between Hamas and Israel, where the bridge is so completely, radically different, one wanting to eliminate Israel, the other wanting to eliminate Hamas, finding a common ground is much more difficult, even for the most skilled negotiators. But again, that is really what you're aiming to do. And it's not a game of poker in which it's winner take all. If you're negotiating with a sovereign nation, they have their own interests. They have to sell their government, their leaders, their publics in the agreement that you've reached. So it has to be a win-win situation. And if it's not a win-win situation, it's not going to be saleable to begin with, and it's not going to be durable in the long run. You begin in many ways with what makes a negotiator successful, with having the president appoint the right person at the right time for the right issue. That is oftentimes, as I just indicated, insufficient if the parties themselves don't have an interest in finding a common ground. But it is a central starting place. It's hard to imagine the opening to China without Henry Kissinger, or the Good Friday Agreement without George Mitchell, or the Dayton Accords without my late friend Dick Holbrooke, or so many other agreements that bear really the names of people who are so identifiable with those agreements. In interviewing 130 people, including secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, foreign officials, Tony Blair, Rudy Ahern, the Prime Minister of Ireland for the Good Friday chapter, and all the generals, at least the majority of the generals, who were leaders of many of the wars I examined, about a third of the book, I arrived at a set of common skills that they brought to the table, even under very disparate circumstances. The first was an ability to see a historical event occur, grab it, and have the determination to follow it through. For example, George H.W. Bush, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, no one anticipated it. No one anticipated it. But he and Jim Baker, who wrote the preface to my book, Kissinger wrote the foreword, saw this as a historic opportunity to not only reunite the Germany, which had been divided after World War II between East and West, one in the Soviet zone, the other in the Western zone, but to do so within NATO. This was an enormous lift. The Soviets had lost 20 million people in World War II. The British and French had fought Germany twice, World War I and World War II. And Margaret Thatcher herself said at the beginning of this process, I love Germany so much, I want to keep two of them. So this is itself an interesting chapter, and it occurred again because they had the foresight to see this was the time it was right to really make something historic happen. The second is courage, not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to depart from established norms, from leaving where your base may be politically, to take risks for peace. Sadat did that when he went to Jerusalem. He lost his foreign minister immediately. He lost his second foreign minister at Camp David. It was a courageous decision. When Mohammed bin Zayed normalized relations in 2020 with Israel, this was really a very brave decision. And when the leaders of the Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland, after 20 years of what the British and Great British understatement called the Troubles, well, the Troubles killed 3,500 people and maimed tens of thousands of others, the Catholic and Protestant leaders finally decided that they were going to courageously seek peace, even if their constituencies wanted to continue fighting. Third is intellect. And it's not just having the intellect of good SAT scores. It is the intellect that comes along with wisdom and judgment. To judge character and the people you're negotiating with. Kissinger and Zhou Enlai certainly showed that in the opening to China. Next is preparation. You all know you're at a great school, that you have to do your homework. And if you're going to be successful in negotiating, you have to do your homework. And that means not just knowing your brief, but understanding the other side's issues. Because without that, you can't really arrive at the compromises you need. So to give you an example of this attribute, we're now in our 13th and last day at Camp David. And Jimmy Carter, in what I think is the greatest single act of presidential personal diplomacy in American history, has drafted 22 peace agreements himself and then shuttled between the Israeli and Egyptian cabins. And we are close, but not there. And Begin comes to Carter's cabin and says, Mr. President, I'm sorry. We've made a lot of progress, but I cannot and will not make any more compromises. I want you to give me a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me back to Jerusalem. And Carter, realizing that this would send Sadat back empty-handed after his courageous act and subject himself to assassination, which happened several years later in any event, and that his own administration and his own presidency would suffer a mortal blow for being unable to do so after 13 days at the presidential retreat. And so, because of preparation, he had read thoroughly the CIA profiles on Begin and Sadat, and he knew that Begin had a very soft spot for his 8 grandchildren. And so he got his personal secretary, Susan Cloud, to make 8 copies of the original photograph of the 3 leaders that was taken on the first day, got the names of each of the grandchildren, and personally autographed each one of the pictures to that grandchild with hopes for peace. Jimmy Carter walks over to Begin's cabin and hands him the photos, and Begin vocalizes the names of each of the photos of his grandchildren as he goes through. And Carter sees Begin's lips quiver and his eyes start to tear. He puts his suitcase down and he says, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try. And that got us over the top. So that is also an important attribute, being prepared. The next is really, I mean, if I had to pick one or two that are the most seminal, it's the capacity to stand in the shoes of your negotiating partner, to see things from their perspective, to understand what they have to bring home to make it successful. Larry Summers, who, when I was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, was my boss. He was Secretary of the Treasury and later became President of Harvard. Larry called it unsympathetic empathy for your opponent's position. Example, we're in the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War. Israel has been set back on its heels, it came as close to losing its state as it probably ever will. And Golda Meir, who was the prime minister, took enormous political heat for being unprepared for this. They counterattacked after getting arms from the U.S. through Nixon and Kissinger, and they now have the cream of Sadat's army, Third Army, encircled in the Egyptian Sinai. And this gives Golda Meir a chance to really recoup politically as well as destroy the most dangerous army they faced. Kissinger, standing in Sadat's shoes, says to Golda, this will be a Pyrrhic victory. If you humiliate Sadat, he'll never make peace. You've got to give him something to show. And he convinces her to let the Third Army go back over the canal. That led to the first and second disengagement agreements that he reached in, and ultimately Camp David, because Sadat had something to show without being humiliated. There's an interesting anecdote about Kissinger and Golda Meir, which is when he was first named Secretary of State. He went to see her and he said, Madam Prime Minister, I want to set the ground rules of our relationship at the beginning. I'm first an American, I'm second Secretary of State, and I'm only third Jewish. And she says, Henry, you forgot that in Hebrew we read from right to left. The next is developing trust and confidence in your negotiating partner. Again, you're not out, and this is such contrast with what we've seen happening in the last 4 weeks, where there's a denigration of all the leadership. It's developing, and this is hard when you're negotiating with someone who has a distinctly different view and is representing perhaps a country that's unsavory, but developing a trust and personal relationship. So, example, in the midst of the German reunification negotiations, which were not going well, Jim Baker, Secretary of State, invites Edward Shevardnadze, who was the Soviet foreign minister, to get away from the lights of Moscow and Washington and negotiate and get to know each other better at Jim Baker's retreat at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And they spend 3 days getting to know each other, talking about their children, their grandchildren, a peaceful Europe that's undivided. And it really gave Shevardnadze the sort of courage to go back and overrule his own foreign ministry and convince Gorbachev that they shouldn't support a united Germany and that they would better have Germany in NATO, where they could be controlled than as a sort of huge lump in the middle of Europe, aligned with Assad. Next is creativity. I call this the art diplomacy because there is an art to it. It's like an artist painting on an easel. There are always going to be impasses that are seemingly insurmountable in negotiations. And you need creativity, and often, by the way, that creativity takes the form of purposely ambiguous language. I mean, if you were writing a contract as a lawyer, you would never use some of the terms that are used in these negotiations because that sometimes gives each side the opportunity to interpret it in different ways. Examples, after the 67 Six-Day War, UN Resolution 242 talked about land for peace, but it said that Israel was obligated to remove themselves and withdraw from quote unquote territories occupied in 67. It didn't say all the territories. Actually, the French version said the territories, but the American version and the one that's been most used is territory. So each could interpret it its own way. Now there's problems with ambiguity because it can sometimes come back to bite you. I mean, here we are, 40 years later, and we still haven't determined what territories really means. But at least it gets you over the hump. George Mitchell, at the beginning of the Good Friday Agreement, was negotiating with 13 political parties, Catholic and Protestant. And while the negotiations are going on, the militias of the Catholic and Protestants are still killing each other. And some of the political parties who were not aligned with militias said, this is crazy. I mean, how can we have a peace negotiation while we have an open conflict? But neither the Catholic or Protestant militias were willing to disarm because they so distrusted the other. They felt if they disarmed and the other didn't, then they would be at a great disadvantage. So Mitchell creatively came up with what became known as the Mitchell Principles, which was that, yes, you could keep your arms, but you had to sign a piece of paper saying that you were in this negotiation to resolve the issues peacefully, and you would abide by that. Now, actually, there were several times during the negotiations where they didn't. And so Mitchell suspended, but didn't cancel the participation of the political party associated with that militia. And then after sometimes 30 days or so, they came back. But again, it was a creative use of language. Next is the requirement of stamina. International negotiations are like an Olympic marathon ending in a sprint. It always seems to end at 3 o'clock in the morning on the last day. And these negotiations go on not for days or weeks, but months and sometimes years. And the negotiator has to have enormous stamina so that at that critical time, you're thinking clearly. The whole term shuttle diplomacy came because after the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War, Kissinger was shuttling between Cairo and Damascus and Jerusalem with almost no break because he felt he had to keep the momentum going. Jimmy Carter averaged maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep for 13 days at Camp David. When I was negotiating the Kyoto climate change protocols, we maybe averaged 3 or 4 hours of sleep. Having that ability to work with sleep deprivation is very important because you need to keep the momentum of a negotiation going. The next, if I can switch from an Olympic to a baseball term, is don't always go for a home run or you'll strike out more often than not. That is, don't try to seek more than you can accomplish. A couple of examples. When Jimmy Carter started the Middle East peace process, he incorrectly tried to hit a home run. He tried to reconvene the 1973 Geneva Conference, which Kissinger had convened and broke up after one day because Assad refused to participate. And Carter's idea was, we're going to comprehensively solve everything. The West Bank, the Golan Heights, Jordan, the Sinai, the status of Jerusalem. It just couldn't bear that kind of weight. And I believe to this day, by the way, that one of the reasons Sadat went to Jerusalem is he realized if he ever got caught up in this morass, he would never get the Sinai back. So go instead for singles and doubles that you can then build on in future years. Camp David, which was a bilateral agreement, there were no Palestinians there because they didn't accept UN Resolution 242. But that bilateral agreement ultimately led to the Abraham Accords, and I think they will ultimately lead to a Saudi normalization. Good Friday is go to that in terms of seeking election. So what are the two big issues in the Good Friday Agreement and the negotiation? The first was, what's the status of Northern Ireland? It was a 100-year dispute. Is it part of the Irish Republic, or should it stay as part of the United Kingdom? And the second big issue was, what do you do about the militias? Now, interestingly, the Good Friday Agreement was historic. To this day, it's been followed. Neither issue was resolved. The issue of the status of Northern Ireland was subject to a referendum if the majority of the population wanted it, and neither side is willing to risk a referendum to do so. So that status remains as it is, but the communities haven't fought. They've learned to live together, and they're going on from there. Will it never be a referendum? Well, the Catholics are now demographically in the majority. Maybe they will ultimately call for one, but even in the Catholic community, only a minority want to risk going back to conflict by having it. And the second is, it took 9 years after the Good Friday Agreement was signed. At the last 6 months of Tony Blair's prime ministership, to finally convince the militias to disarm. So again, you have to go for what you can take. When the JCPOA agreement was reached with Iran, 2015, the nuclear agreement, you know, the people who opposed it said, well, you know, you didn't deal with missile development, you didn't deal with Iran's support for terrorism, and that's true. But that would have been too much water for that agreement to carry. Getting the agreement done on the nuclear issue was a huge step, and that takes me to the next. Well, let me skip over and come to that in just a second. The next is using back channels. Sometimes the parties are so distrustful, so much in opposition, that they won't get into the same room with each other, like Hamas and Israel now. I mean, the hostage deal, phase one, was done by intermediaries, back channels, like Qatar and Egypt and the United States. The famous Oslo Accords, 1993, were done by non-official representatives of the Palestinians and the Israelis, with the back channel of Norway, so secret that when my friend Yossi Balin, who helped organize this, finally had a substantial agreement of mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO, he went to his foreign minister, Shimon Peres, who then went to Rabin, the prime minister, who didn't know at all that Oslo happened. He literally didn't know it happened. And Yossi said his most difficult day of his life was whether, in effect, Rabin would accept it or not. So back channels are tremendously important. Now, next is not to abandon the agreements that your predecessor has reached. There's always a temptation with a new president to say, you know, I'm king of the road, I defeated this guy, why do I need to follow what he's done? I've got a better way of doing it. And let me give you 3 examples. Example number 1 is in 1980, Ronald Reagan decisively defeated us, Jimmy Carter, for a variety of reasons. But one of the issues that he criticized us for was the SALT II nuclear agreement with the Soviet Union, which he said gave too little to the United States and too much to the Soviets. Of course, we disagreed with that, but that's what he said. Once he was sworn in as president, even though that treaty was never ratified by the Senate, Reagan, followed it to the T for the full 7 years of the agreement, realizing that if he pulled the rug out from under the Soviets and said, well, Carter did it and I could do it better, he would never have been able to negotiate the next nuclear agreement because they wouldn't trust him or his successor. Now, 2 examples on the other side. First, on climate change. which is again one of the agreements that I've negotiated. We are an extraordinarily bad negotiating partner on climate change because it depends on who gets elected as president in the next 4 years. We've been in and out. We've been in with, Clinton and Obama and Biden. We're out with the Bushes and Trump. First thing he did, I predicted this months before the election. I said the first week, maybe the first day, we'll be out of the Paris Agreement. And we are. So then we go to the Chinese and we say, now you're the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases. You need to do more. And they say, what are you talking about? You've withdrawn from the whole process. So this is an instability in our system. We're one of the few countries that really dishonors international agreements reached by our predecessors. The other example is the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear agreement. And it was with Iran, and it was reached by the so-called P5, that is the permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. So it's the P5 plus 1 negotiating with Iran. It was done in 2015, and Iran punctiliously followed every commitment they had to make as indicated by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, who had 24/7 cameras and spot inspections and so forth. No one contested, including the Trump administration, that Iran had ever violated the agreement. 2018, Trump withdraws from the agreement and says, we're going to use force and more sanctions and get a better deal. Pulls out of the chair unilaterally. So under the agreement, Iran had to reduce its enriched uranium to 2.5%, which is civilian grade uranium. It's nowhere near military grade. Now, as a result of pulling out of this thing, they have gone to 60% enriched uranium, and within 3 or 4 weeks could easily go to 90%, which is total weapons grade. Second, we eliminated 2/3 of their centrifuges, which spin out uranium, and they were totally disabled. Now, as a result of pulling out, Iran has put in a whole new generation of centrifuges which spin at even faster rates. We got the plutonium plant at a town called Iraq disabled, cemented in, and now it's running again. And the IAEI's inspections are much less intrusive than were required under the IAEA. So when you depart from this and you do so unilaterally, it can really lead to totally catastrophic results. And we're now in a situation where Iran is very close to having a breakthrough and a breakout, which you can do in a matter of weeks. Last is leverage, the ability to use leverage. Now, we all use leverage every single day of the week with our spouses, our partners, our friends, our children, our grandchildren, and my leverage with my grandchildren, I have to say, is minimal. But the ability to use leverage is really critical, and there are 2 types of leverage. There's negative and positive leverage. Positive leverage is the following. We have a giant market. If we allow, as part of a deal, another country to have access to that market, that gives them an incentive to reach a trade agreement. The last cog in the wheel to get the UAE to normalize relations under the Abraham Accords in 2020 with Israel was not something Israel provided. It was rather the fact that they wanted the mediator, the United States, to provide them with F-35 fighter jets, which Trump did, and rightly so. And that was the final grease that sort of oiled the wheel. Negative incentives take the following forms. First, economic sanctions. I was the so-called sanctions meister in the Clinton administration, negotiated with the EU on Helms-Burton and the Iran Libya Sanctions Act and so forth. Sanctions are not as effective as they used to be. Just think of today. We've got sanctions against Russia, and they're still advancing in Ukraine. We have sanctions on China. It hasn't deterred them. We have sanctions on Iran, and as I say, they've advanced their nuclear program. We have sanctions on Maduro in Venezuela, and he's still in office. So I'm not saying that sanctions are not useful, but in and of themselves, they are not going to do the job. We have more sanctions on more countries than all the other countries put together. It's sort of our default mechanism. When we don't know what the hell else to do, we say we're going to impose sanctions on them. Second is the threat of force. And that can be very useful without actually using force. So in 1994 in Haiti, President Clinton sends former President Carter and Colin Powell and Senator Nudd to try to get the dictator who had unseated an elected prime minister to cede power to the elected prime minister, and he refuses until Clinton orders B-52s to start flying from the United States. He gets the word, and that threat is sufficient to do the job. The last is the actual use of military force, and this is the most difficult decision a president has to make, putting young men and young women in harm's way. And after interviewing, again, leading generals, diplomats who negotiated the end of these wars, the following lessons about when to use force. First is only if it is in the supreme national interest of the United States. And that means that there are terrible conflicts going on all over the world. Right now, as we speak, there's a terrible genocide in Sudan. But it's simply not sufficiently in our interest to commit military forces. Next, it should be the last, not the first option. You should exhaust diplomacy. You should exhaust economic sanctions. You should exhaust the threat before you go in. Third, this is a lesson that I got from Steve Hadley and Condoleezza Rice. I think she's associated with
She's director of who?
Yeah. And they were, of course, respectively, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State to George W. Bush in the Second Iraq War. And what they said was we made a lot of mistakes in that war. But the biggest was to intervene militarily before we knew what the political outcome we wanted to achieve was going to be. And that we oftentimes do it backwards, Steve's words. First, you should decide what can be politically achieved, and then you build your military strategy around it, not the other way around. Israel forgot this as well. We're now way into our second year of warfare. They never have had, and they still don't have a political plan for what happens at the end of the Gaza war. Next, when you use military force, you have to understand the dynamics, the history, the culture of the countries you're intervening. General Petraeus said to me, you need to understand the nuances of the country you're intervening, and we did not in either Afghanistan or Iraq. We really didn't understand those countries. We tried to make Western democracies out of tribal organizations. And we didn't understand in deposing Saddam Hussein, which we did very quickly, we were deposing a minority Sunni dictator and a majority Shiite country. So understanding this is tremendously important. Next is recognize that even the best laid military plans will have unexpected and costly sidebars that don't go according to plan. Let's take Afghanistan. We really didn't appreciate until well into the war that the Taliban had an escape mechanism. They could go right across the border to Pakistan, rest, reload, and come back, and we could not get them in Pakistan. Pakistan was an ally. Most of our arms came through Pakistan to get to Afghanistan, and they had in effect a safe haven, which we didn't appreciate initially. Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, once said, "Everyone has a great plan when they go into the ring until the other guy hits you in the mouth." Well, this is what happens in the military situation. So in Kosovo, 1999, NATO is bombing Serbia for 77 straight days to try to get Milosevic, the dictator in Serbia, to the negotiating table. During one of those days, over Belgrade, we bomb the Chinese embassy and kill a number of Chinese diplomats. To this day, the Chinese think we did it on purpose. Of course, we didn't. But it's, again, one of the things you simply have to calculate when you get into. Next is to use decisive force. That's the term that Colin Powell used when I interviewed him. So let's take the two Iraq wars and the two Bushes. The first Iraq war, just to refresh your recollection, was when Saddam had gone into Kuwait, and the goal was to get them out of here. Second was to depose Saddam 13 years later, totally depose him. So George H.W. Bush and Colin Powell did it right. They got a United Nations resolution, which, by the way, China and Russia did not veto, authorizing the use of force. And here again was ambiguous, didn't say the use of force. It said, quote unquote, use all necessary means. He got a NATO resolution. He got a coalition of 38 countries together, total of 500,000 troops. And they got the job done. And then they were criticized, Bush and Colin Powell, for not tracking Saddam on the run and getting rid of him. I mean, I talked about having the Third Army in Egypt. They had the capacity to just do away with them right there and go to Baghdad. And Colin Powell says, if we break it, we own it. His son, Bush's son, 13 years later, forgets every one of those lessons. A much more ambitious political agenda, in fact, make Iraq into a democracy. No UN resolution, no NATO resolution, a very thin coalition. Our primary backup was Great Britain, which lost the prime ministership for Tony Blair. And it was the antithesis of decisive force. The Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, said, we're going to get this done with a quote unquote light footprint. And our initial intervention was with 10,000 troops. We then had to have surge after surge after surge to get it done. So if you're going to use force, it has to be, again, decisive. And last is the use of good intelligence. So if you remember that the whole thesis behind going into Iraq in the Second Iraq War was because they had weapons of mass destruction. Okay, we get in and we intervene, we search, and there are no weapons of mass destruction. But I actually found out in doing the research for my book that Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction, but he had secretly destroyed them in compliance with the UN mandate. Well, for goodness sakes, if that's the case, why didn't he say so and save his own life and his regime and the lives of thousands of Americans and British and Iraqi soldiers? Because he was afraid if he announced it publicly. It would embolden his domestic opponents and encourage Iran, his mortal enemy, to now invade. I was in an administration that was subject to one of the worst intelligence failures in American history. So let's go now, we're in 1979 in Iran. And 6 weeks before, the Shah of Iran, who had been on the peacock throne since 1953 and was favored by 6 American presidents, Republican and Democrat, he had an open shopping list, anything he wanted. So the CIA reports, and I have the report, now declassified by the way, that Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor even a pre-revolutionary state, 6 weeks before he leaves. And Carter gets that. I mean, what's a president to do? If we had known earlier, it would have happened. And they didn't realize, the CIA, that he had incurable cancer. It's just unbelievable intelligence failure. So let's go to Gaza and talk about intelligence failures. So Gaza had, in my estimation, 2 major failures. One was a strategic failure, and one was an intelligence failure. The strategic mistake was for Netanyahu's government to systematically try to weaken an already weak Palestinian authority to avoid a 2-state solution. And weakening them meant withholding their customs duties. Israel, under Oslo, would collect the customs duties on Palestinian products and then send the money to the PA, Palestinian Authority. And they just kept holding it up. I mean, so they couldn't pay their soldiers, they couldn't pay their civil servants. Just a terrible result. Now, the intelligence failure was the following, and this came from 2 Israeli generals. Dennis Ross and I co-chair a think tank in Israel called the Jewish People's Policy Institute, and we got a briefing from 2 senior generals who said this was maybe even worse than our intelligence failure in the Yom Kippur War, because we didn't realize, although it was right under our noses, that Hamas had transformed itself from a terrorist group into a full-blown, well-trained, well-organized, well-trained terrorist army, 35,000 strong. And yes, they said, we knew there were tunnels from Egypt into Gaza and that Egypt was, to some extent, trying to block them. What we didn't realize, they said, is they have 150 plus miles of tunnels, and they may have more because we haven't found all of them. And some are as deep as 25-story building. Now, how in the hell do you build a tunnel that deep right next to Israel with the Mossad and so forth, and nobody knows about it? So it's just a massive intelligence failure. And then they actually were able to capture the intelligence plan down to the use of gliders and the destruction of the communications towers in the Israeli Negev. And it came into the hands of a female analyst, and she started passing it up the line. She said, you know, we've got to be prepared for this. And the further up it went in the chain, the more they disregarded it, saying, there's no way Hamas can possibly organize this. And that's, you know, here we have October 7th. So intelligence is absolutely crucial to the use of military force and to avoiding the use of military force. Now, that'll take me to Gaza, and I'll just make one statement there and we'll take your questions.
Okay.
And I don't want to talk about, I will talk about in the question period, the whole diplomatic issue of Gaza, but I want to stress one thing, and that is, with all the demonstrations that are going on the campuses, I don't know if they are happening here, but I saw them in Columbia and Emory and Brandeis and otherwise. So let's look at some very quick picture of history. 1947, the UN divides the British Mandate into what was called a Jewish state, it didn't have a name at that point, and an Arab state. Israel accepts the division, names itself Israel, and the Arabs go to war. Camp David, 1978, 77, 78, the treaty. No Palestinians are there, as I mentioned, none. And the best we could come up with, because Sadat said, I have to have something for the Palestinians to go home with the Egyptians, to the Arab world. And so we came up with the concept of quote unquote full autonomy. Now, we had no idea what full autonomy meant, but we started negotiating that. Saul Linowitz, who negotiated also the Panama Canal Treaty. And Carter lost the election. Reagan didn't care about full autonomy, and we've never really developed. But that was, again, during the Carter administration. Now, fast forward to Camp David II. We now have Clinton and Arafat and Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Israel. The Clinton parameters are developed in which Israel agrees to give the Palestinians 95% of the West Bank. And East Jerusalem is the capital of a Palestinian state. Arafat rejects it. The Second Intifada starts. I'm going to come back to 2000 in a minute with a personal story. Now go to 2005. Eric Sharon is the prime minister, famous general in the 73 war, very hard line. And he decides it's a mistake to keep Israeli troops and settlers in Gaza. Unilaterally pulls all of the IDF soldiers out, but not before they pull out 7,000 settlers. And I wish we could show the videos of that in all the college campuses, kicking and screaming out of their apartments permanently. And all the infrastructure was left, which Hamas, when it won the election, destroyed and sends Israel rockets instead of roses. And then 2009, Ehud Olmert is prime minister. Abbas is the Palestinian head. He's now in his 16th year of a 4-year term. And he offers 96% of the West Bank, making up the 4% by giving part of the Egyptian Sinai. East Jerusalem is the capital, and allowing 50,000 refugees to come back permanently for family reunion. Rejected. Now, I want to take you, I'll stop at this to take your questions, with a personal anecdote. So we're now in July of 2000, and I'm Deputy Treasury Secretary of the Treasury, and I have an additional mandate of being in charge of the economic dimension of the peace process. And we had gotten almost 50,000 Palestinians in the West Bank allowed to come into Israel as day workers. We had the unemployment rate down to 8% in the West Bank, according to World Bank figures. We had it down to 14% in Gaza. And we got Congress to pass a law called qualifying industrial zones. And what it meant was that any country, at that time it was only Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority, that had a peace agreement with Israel, could set up an industrial park. And the companies in that industrial park, if they used as little as 10% Israeli content, could send back the product duty-free to the United States. So what I saw in July of 2000 was really beautiful. In Gaza, there were 30 plants, not Israeli plants. Not one of them was Israeli plants. These were plants from Japan, from Singapore, from Europe, from the United States. Again, using that small amount of Israeli content and having the ability to ship back duty free. Employing 1,200 Gazans, and they showed me where the second phase of the industrial park was. All the foundations were already being put in. Another 30 plants, another 1,200, 1,500 Gazans employed. And I went into one of the plants, and I saw product being loaded onto a flatbed truck, go through the Eretz crossing to the airport that we built for the Palestinians, the Corps of Engineers, so they could export their strawberries.
Gaza.
Beautiful new airport. It goes right to the Gaza airport, and they did it with flowers and stuff like this. And there was one unarmed Israeli soldier overlooking the entire operation. One unarmed Israeli soldier. Now, during that same swing, and then I went back to see Arafat in Ramallah. And I tell them how excited we were. We could build on this. We had some other initiatives coming up. And before I could start, he said, Mr. Secretary, I have something I want you to tell your president, President Clinton. And I said, what is that, Mr. President? He said, well, tell him not to invite me to Camp David for the summit. And I said, why shouldn't he? And he said, I'm not prepared to make the compromises he wants. Well, we did invite him. He didn't make them. And it fell apart. One humorous anecdote about qualifying industrial zones is that during that same July swing in the region, I went to a small town in northern Jordan called Irbid. It's in the more fundamentalist part of Jordan. And I went into this massive plant. It was their first qualifying industrial zone. And I mean, it was like a half a football field. Hundreds of women in full hijabs, white. They were sewing and using sewing machines and so forth and stitching. And the manager of the plant says, would you like to see what they're making, Mr. Secretary? And I said, yes. So I went over and they were making lingerie for Victoria's Secret. And I said, that's the real peace process. So why don't we stop?
That's a great line on which to stop. Okay, thank you so much. Why don't we open it up now to anyone who has a question of Ambassador Eizenstat? Anyone?
Well, I'll ask myself one,
Well,
but you should go. Okay.
why don't you introduce yourself? We'll start with Leo and then come to the woman next.
Hi, my name is Leo. I work at Hoover on an oral history project at U.S.-China relations. And I wanted to ask you about your China experience. I know you've seen a lot from Carter to Clinton and to try to diplomacy, but that's not touched too much today. So I just wonder about your experience, your observation, especially from the angle of something in something like in a negotiation, you want to take a little and get a little, but you're also negotiating with a partner that you don't necessarily like and would very much prefer that they go away. And in that scenario, what do you really do? Whatever you do in a win-win situation, you're going to strengthen the other party. What you really want is for them to be gone, but you end up actually helping them in the process by engaging in the negotiations.
Well, you don't want them gone, because if they're gone, then you're not going to solve the problem. You want them to be convinced that it's in their interest to do what's also in our interest. And in the JCPOA negotiations, where there was enormous distrust and bitterness between the Iranian and U.S. sides when they finally got together, and John Kerry, Secretary of State, was negotiating with their foreign minister, and he ended up, they ended one round with great bitterness. And Kerry went to his hotel room and said, look, let's both calm down. This is a manageable problem if we do the following. And you give me your thoughts. So sometimes you just have to break down. If you're sitting at a table like this, I mean, you see these formalized tables on the news with the U.S. side and the Russian side. I mean, nothing gets accomplished then. It all is done by side room talk, by small groups. And what Mitchell did in Northern Ireland is he basically put different groups in different rooms before he put them together. Sadat and Begin at Camp David met once in 13 days. They hated each other. They were like two scorpions in a bottle. So Carter put them together the first day in his cabin. And Sadat made a major mistake of sort of reading a plan with maximum things for Egypt and nothing for Israel. And he felt, well, I've got to show the Arabs that I'm trying to do. And Begin just was furious. Carter was furious at him. And they never got back together again until the last day when they actually signed. And Carter decided that was obviously not going to work. So what he did, and it sort of gets to your question in a way, he creatively decided to negotiate behind the back of Begin. Sadat basically said to him, you know what I need. I'm putting my full confidence in you. But Begin was an extraordinarily difficult negotiator. What we did is Carter went around him to his foreign minister, Moshe Dayan, to his defense minister, Ezer Weizman, and in particular to his legal advisor, Aharon Barak, who became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And by negotiating with them and with Osama al-Baz, who was the legal advisor to Sadat, that's how it got done. It could never have gotten done if Begin and Sadat were together, or if Carter was negotiating only with Begin. It was just frustrating, absolutely frustrating. Every one of Carter's advisors advised him not to go to Camp David. Every single one. There was getting failure because they had spent months after Sadat's visit in bilateral agreements getting nowhere. And so he used, again, personal items. So, for example, on the first Sunday after they arrived, he took both Sadat and Begin in his presidential limousine to the Gettysburg battlefield. And he wanted to show them by that battlefield. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's a very moving place. And it was implicitly saying there should be, you can't fight anymore. This is going to be the result. And Sadat, who was a general and had studied in the United States, started expounding on all the mistakes the Confederates had made, like Dickens' last charge, which for Carter as a Southerner was a little uncomfortable. But Begin, who was not a military man at all, extemporaneously gave the whole Gettysburg Address. So it's a very emotional point. Another item to try to break down the distrust is he made the first kosher Shabbat dinner ever, for or since, at Camp David, and then attended it for Begin and his group, again, to try to break down the distrust. And again, I mentioned the last thing, which was the photograph. So you just have to come up with creative ways to try to break down the distrust. Now, again, if you're with a negotiating partner like Hamas, who just fundamentally has no interest in anything other than destroying you, that's a different story, because then you have to really try to find ways to sideline them completely and deal with people who are more reasonable.
Okay, go ahead, and then Benji, go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to hear this insider view of all these historical events. My question was, do you have any reflections on the role of public opinion, either in the U.S. or in these countries that the U.S. has been helping to resolve their conflicts? Kind of how is this relevant?
That's a really good question. First of all, if you're dealing with, as we often are, with autocrats. Public opinion doesn't mean anything. They manipulate public. They have lost 600,000 Russians, either death or casualties. And he's still got 70% popularity. It's in democracies where this can be important, but even in some cases in autocracies. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the Soviets went in Christmas Day 1979. I was at the White House at the time, and they stayed 9 years trying to beat what ultimately became the Taliban. And they withdrew because of public opinion. Not that anybody voted, certainly in the Soviet Union, but there was a mother's movement when these body bags started coming back. And they felt tremendous pressure to end it. It's ironic that now, with a quantum number of casualties, that public pressure hasn't occurred, but it hasn't. So, but with democracies, it does matter. In some negotiations, I have one chapter on international trade. Public opinion, in a way, is built into the whole structure. You have advisory groups for business, from labor. Congress has to approve the negotiating mandate. So there you really are starting with politics. And, you know, we ended up withdrawing from Afghanistan. We ended up withdrawing from Vietnam because public opinion had just gotten over the top. And we couldn't sustain. If you look at the Vietnam agreement, it's really not a peace agreement, it's a withdrawal agreement. And there's a message for Ukraine and that in Afghanistan. So Henry Kissinger got a Nobel Prize for negotiating the Vietnam peace agreement. He negotiated it with North Vietnam, but not with South Vietnam, for whom we lost 58,000 lives, all on the wall in Washington. They weren't in the room, any way, shape, or form. Then in the Afghanistan situation, when Secretary Pompeo started negotiations with his envoy, the negotiations between the United States and the Taliban, without the government, we had been there for 20 years fighting. And when Biden finished it, he didn't bring them in either. And then everybody said, oh, they fell, within days. Well, what the hell? They had no say-so in it. All our troops are gone. All our private contractors who made the maintenance possible of the equipment they had. So what are they supposed to do? Now, that's going to potentially happen right now with Zelensky. I mean, this is why the notion of going to see Putin and talking to Putin first over the head of both the Europeans and the Ukrainians is so destructive. It's repeating the same mistake that we made there.
Benjamin.
I'm curious about the idea of the threat of violence as it relates to deterrence and credibility, in the sense that I think there are red lines that, if you don't follow through after a red line, right, and you see that, or you see a public in a democracy that's really kind of anti-engagement, or massive intelligence flaw, and you see something like October 7th. I think we've seen that with both the United States and Israel. Surely other examples. I think that there's the idea of carrying a big stick and never bluffing, but then occasionally when there are bluffs, how do you recover credibility, or how do you recover?
The best example of that, and the most destructive, was Obama with 2 red lines about chemical weapons in Syria. And he said, if we find chemical weapons, we're going to intervene. And he did. It really was a horrific mistake. So you shouldn't make threats if you're not going to potentially use them. Doesn't mean every time you make a threat, you go to war, but you have to be prepared to do that. I mean, an example really is again, let's take the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy didn't, and he was under tremendous pressure when they found, nuclear weapons in Cuba, tremendous pressure to bomb. There's a beautiful book, Bobby Kennedy, 13 Days, which actually I taught for 9 years at the Kennedy School, and I've used that as one of my case studies. he was under enormous pressure. But he decided to use a blockade instead, which is, by the way, what I recommended when our hostages were taken in Iran. It's not followed. But that threat of force was sufficient, but he was prepared to go all the way if he had to. But not doing it, you ended up with a negotiated settlement.
Is there a means to recover the credibility lost, like in situations like in Syria?
Okay, you'll be the last one,
No,
so.
I just want to say Ambassador Eizenstat has very kindly suggested that if any students or faculty would like to stay for a few more minutes after 1:30, we have a little bit more
Okay.
time. We can do that informally and end at 1:30 formally.
Well, I promised to take his question, so let me take it. Go ahead, at the far end there.
Great. Lawrence Marks, had the honor of working for Ambassador Eizenstat in Brussels 30 years ago. in
Oh,
my
wow,
US
thank
mission. So
Nice to see
really
you.
honored to be here with you, Stuart.
Thank you.
Europeans today are faced with a massive dilemma of what they do in the face of everything in Ukraine. If you were advising MERS, who's just started in Germany, and Macron and the Europeans in general, Keir in the UK, what would you tell them to
Well,
do?
let me just say, I think for the young people here in this meeting, I don't think you can possibly appreciate the absolutely revolutionary thing that's happened in the last week, 2 weeks, which is it's fulfilled Putin's wildest dreams of separating the United States and Europe. The whole transatlantic architecture that we built 80 years ago and have nurtured ever since, including after the end of the Cold War, is at risk of being totally dissipated. It's absolutely stunning and unbelievable. So we have, and you and I were of course in Brussels together. I mean, the Europeans, it's true, and in this respect, Trump in his first term had a significant point. We bear too much of the burden and they bear too little of their own defense. I mean, after all, we're in Europe, they're not in NATO and the United States. And NATO agreed with some pressure from the US to a 2% of GDP defense spending for all NATO members. Well, today, in 2025, 23 of the 32 members are at that figure. Now, Trump, just off the top of his head, said, well, now it should be 5%. Well, we're at 3.5%. I mean, it's just sort of raising the bar, but even at 2%, you've got, 9 countries that are not there. So if the US either actually withdraws its troops or withdraws, in effect, its Article 5 guarantee, it puts the Europeans in a horrific situation. They're not militarily prepared. There's no, except under NATO, which we can veto, they're under no joint command. Their defense industries are nowhere near ours, even France and the UK and Germany. And so they leave themselves defenseless. It will give Putin a tremendous victory. And it's a really potentially catastrophic situation. So what do you do about it? I mean, if you're Merz, Macron, who made one of the stupidest mistakes in modern history in calling the spot election, but you've got to say, and Merz said this in his victory speech 2 days ago. He said, we have to face the prospect that the United States is not going to be there in our defense. And therefore, we have to now build ourselves up. But I mean, for example, for Ukraine, it would take 4 to 5 years to give them the kind of sophisticated equipment that we're able to give them, even if they build up. So what I would suggest is the following, and that is, our new Secretary of Defense also made a terrible mistake. It's against all diplomatic norms, which is he openly said before the negotiations ever started he was giving up 2 of the bargaining chips. We're never gonna let them in NATO, and they're not gonna get their territory back. I mean, and you know, that's before Putin ever sat down, before he ever gave anything on his side. So there are 2 ways to solve this. One is in 1953, the Korean War was not ended by a peace treaty. There's never been for 70 years a treaty between North and South Korea. There's an armistice, like a permanent ceasefire. And the demarcation point, the so-called DMZ, the demilitarized zone, is where the last point of conflict was. So one way is to say, okay, we're gonna have a permanent ceasefire. You get to keep 18%, and you know we have some kind of commitment for a permanent ceasefire, but you don't have any relief from sanctions, and we don't recognize this territory as Russian territory. Now, Trump won't agree to that. If we agreed to it, that would be a reasonable negotiating position. But that would be too favorable to us, and so Trump won't agree to it. It's not favorable enough to Russia. So the second way, and I want, you know, I talked about putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So let's now put ourselves in Zelensky's shoes. You're now at the negotiating table with the Russians. The war has not gone well the last 18 months, and this is a mistake of Biden. We did not give them arms quickly enough. It's too little, too late. At a time when Russia was really on its heels, we should have been rushing Abrams tanks and F-16s. Terrible mistake. But okay, so now we're at the negotiating table. And Zelensky says, look, now the key issue is guarantees. I'm willing to concede some of the territory, but what guarantee do I have that Putin won't simply rest and reload and start again? And he says, you know, you Americans have a saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And he says, we know we've been fooled twice. 1994, the Budapest Memorial, in which they give up the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for a paper promise not to invade, which he then violates and takes Crimea. Second time is in the Minsk Agreement, Minsk 1 and 2, 2015, where we become a assurer, not a guarantor, but assure that if the fighting stops in the Donbass area, that will be the end of it. And we will assure that if there is further fighting, we will help Ukraine. So what happens? 7 years later, February 21st, 2022, 3 days before the actual invasion of Ukraine, Putin says publicly, quote unquote, Minsk is no more. He just tears it up. So Zelensky says, well, am I going to be a 3-time loser now? You're not going to let me into NATO. The Americans say don't want to put troops in. So what guarantee do I have? And I mean, there are a couple of answers. One is to become a member more rapidly of the European Union, but even on a fast timetable, we're talking about 5 years. I think even though there's no mutual defense agreement, as you know, between the EU member states, it would be really hard, I think, for Putin to invade a EU country. Second would be to put individual country troops there, and the expansion of Brits have already indicated under certain circumstances they would be willing, without a NATO pact, and not on the front lines, but as a backup, so at least it's some trip weapon. And that's about the best you can hope for at this point. Certainly under the current circumstances and with the administration in the U.S. with the position that it has.
Well, I think we should close now and let those of us who need to go move on and let you eat your lunch. Others, if you want to stay, you're welcome to for a little while. But please join me in thanking Ambassador Eizenstat.